I also want to acknowledge the wonderful opportunity that the creation of this center is giving to those of us who've done work over the years in this general area, and appreciate very, very much the opportunity for all of us to get together and exchange our views, try to understand more about each other's work, and hopefully take this to another level. I also want to begin by saying that a lot of material that my colleague has just begun with dovetails with material that I'm going to talk about to some extent, and I'm going to skip through it as we proceed along. It has become commonplace conversation among American Jews, especially within the modern Orthodox and Haredi circles, to view the anti-Semitic threat to American Jews to be more serious coming from the political left than from the right. This is true as well among American Jewish supporters of Netanyahu and the entire Israeli right. These American Jews also believe that Israel faces its most serious threat from the left-wing politicians, specifically those in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They view them as a pro-Palestinian voice in American politics. While not denying this concern, this paper argues that this view misreads where American politics is today, as well as misreads the history of anti-Semitism in America. Moreover, it is largely driven by Republicans, especially by most of the pro-Trump enthusiasts. In considering anti-Semitism in America, it is essential to remember that Jews in America have had a very different experience and a much shorter history than Jews in Europe or in the Muslim world. As a result, the nature and roots of anti-Semitism in Britain and the European continent have a much longer and uglier history. Anti-Semitism in Europe today, as well as historically, is present on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. European Jewry long has felt the presence of authoritarian governments from the tolerated or even orchestrated attacks against Jews. In modern times, this has emerged from the likes of Hitler on the one hand, or Viktor Orban, Joseph Stalin, Nicolae Ceausescu. Anglo Jewry alone has endured Oswald Mosley and Jeremy Corbyn. The United States had its isolated fanatical preachers, such as Charles Coughlin and Louis Farrakhan, but no one has risen to a significant position of political power. America's had other demagogues, and some, like Senator Huey Long, have held political office, but this is nothing compared to Jean-Marie Le Pen or Horg Heider. At the same time, it is important to recognize that America has endured a long, ugly history of extremist politics, expressed in the deep-seated racism and the use of violence in the United States. More than 60 years ago, in the 1960s, only after America experienced significant racial disturbances and rioting, did most Americans begin to recognize the extensive history of violence in the country. It would take the issuance of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders report in 1968 to document the long history of deep-seated violence, especially against racial minorities. This report recognized that the pervasive discrimination and racism required governmental action to change the direction of future American society. While the Commission had been tasked to assess the 1967 racial disturbances and riots in Detroit, Michigan, the report set down a marker for political figures and governmental officials to consider the pervasiveness of the problem in American society. I should point out that this current commission, to this very day, is cited very, very often as the sort of beginning seed for an overwhelming understanding that we have to address the extremism in the United States. It is only recently that governmental leaders and politicians and academicians have begun to recognize the seriousness and the extent to contemporary extremism in America. Enter the reality to recognize the problem of anti-Semitism. Unlike most other hatreds which attract supporters on a specific point on left-right political spectrum, or those who identify with a particular movement or issue, anti-Semitism has the quote-unquote unique feature of attracting supporters from across all branches of politics who identify with humankind's oldest hatred. As has been the case throughout the world, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the United States for the past several decades, as was pointed out in some of the data that's already been put before you, even in the last decade itself. As pervasive as anti-Semitism has been around the world, manifestations of it in the U.S. historically have been intermittent and consistently milder. It has been filled with many of the classic tropes of Christ-killing Jewish money, power, media control, professional dominance, etc. Nevertheless, anti-Semitism in America has never been especially class-related or exclusive to a region of the country. America has never experienced pogroms such as those that occurred throughout Europe in response to the infamous litany of lies, etc. Following the Shoah, traditional violent anti-Semitism in the West experienced a period of relative quiescence, except in the USSR and some of its satellite states. This was also true in the Arab states. Violence against Jews in Palestine and to a lesser extent in Arab lands, which had in earnest already begun in the 1920s, increased even more after 1948. Wars, terrorist incidents, military and paramilitary confrontations, and political fights have ensued over the decades between Israel and her Arab neighbors, with times of peace and new peace arrangements developing as well. Internal fighting erupted sporadically, especially after the founding of the PLO in 1964. Pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anti-Zionism rhetoric in pro-Palestinian expression and anti-Israel, anti-Zionism persisted and intensified, especially after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Simultaneously with this was the increasing pressure and support for Soviet Jews to be granted the right to emigrate and escape Soviet persecution. Once the gates of the Soviet Union were opened and the control of the USSR was broken, the international community rallied behind the escape achieved by millions of Soviet Jews. Those who supported Arab protests against the increased emigration to the state were extremely marginal. Those who persisted in labeling Israel as the contemporary proponent of colonialism and later the practitioners of apartheid never reached a significant number, certainly not in that moment. Not to dismiss the presence of anti-Israel groups on campus today, or even then to some extent, incidental congressional questioning of the blanket support for Israel, those voices largely on the left have been and always historically were transitory. And that's, by the way, one of the primary conclusions that I'm going to develop. It is here that the reason that I suggest to you the threat is really on the right. The extensive expression of right-wing anti-Semitism in the United States has occurred largely as a result of a resurgence of the baser values in American culture and national politics, although, as will be shown, anti-Semitism has been present since its inception. The increase in violent attacks against Jews, synagogues, schools, and institutions has evolved in large part out of the tacit acceptance of violence and extremism in America today. Many Jews fail or refuse to recognize that this anti-Semitic behavior has been encouraged and stimulated largely by those on the right, many of whom are and continue to be supporters of former President Donald Trump. Extremist groups, right-wing politicians, extremist media commentators, and by white supremacists and racists. These groups are largely male-led, composed of lower middle class, lesser educated, and underemployed. I should point out something interesting, and I'll get to it later. You know, it has reached the point that one of the major groups attacking Jews today is now called the Goyim Defense League. That's, we talk about Oath Keepers and we talk about other groups, but this is the latest, and it's sort of remarkable. As a result, anti-Semitic violence and slandering Jews has been far more mainstream than it has been than it has been previously in decades. It is essential to consider the growth of this white supremacy movement in the United States. Extremism has been part of American life since the colonists arrived. It did not begin with the Boston Massacre or the French and Indian Wars, what is called here the 7 Years' War. Violence is so deeply embedded in American history that many people just ignore it. It is this extremist tradition which is being manifested by violent radical groups in the United States today. White supremacists believe that their long-standing political and social superiority is being severely threatened and that their violent response underlies their effort to perpetuate it at all costs. Most extremists do not engage in thinking about their existence from within a deep historical or cultural context. Their responses are visceral and personal. Most observers sense that the extreme white supremacists in the U.S. mostly are targeting people of color. These extremists see their vision of the U.S. as a white nation slipping away from them, so that this is their fight to keep America white. In part, that is why so many on the right could not accept the election of Barack Obama as president. Their resentment and rejection of Obama was partly responsible for forming the hardcore underpinning for the campaign and election of Donald Trump. The connection to anti-Semitism is made effectively by Eric Ward, who has been fighting white nationalists since 1990. Eric Ward, a black researcher, senior fellow, and activist associated with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the executive director of Western States Center in the Pacific Northwest, wrote his first major study in 2017 entitled Skin in the Game. Ward analyzed the relationship of white nationalism and perceived white supremacy together with anti-Semitism. He observed that white nationalists, anti-black racists are being fed by anti-Semitism. Ward wrote, and I quote, "American white nationalism, which emerged in the wake of the 1960s civil rights struggle and descends from white supremacism, is a revolutionary social movement committed to building a whites-only nation, and anti-Semitism forms its theoretical core." He continues, "What is this arch nemesis of the white race, whose machinations have prevented the natural and inevitable imposition of white supremacy? It is, of course, the Jews. Jews function for today's white nationalists as they often have for anti-Semites through the centuries, as the demons stirring in an otherwise changing and heterogeneous pot of lesser evils," unquote. It is white supremacists, many of whom consciously or subconsciously transcribe to this thesis, who compose a significant portion of the Trump base. This core includes Jewish Trumpers and Israelis who support Trump, who do not understand that white supremacists are all predominantly anti-Semitic. It is the object of this study that I have done to analyze that presence within the white supremacist movement, that it's integral to American history. Finally, I try in this study, I obviously will not have all the time today, to defend and protect protect themselves, how Jews try to defend themselves from the continuing presence of right-wing anti-Semitism. One of the things that I try to show you in this study is that we have specific examples that are ignored about anti-Semitism, even prior to the horrors of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which I will mention in a moment. But what is critical to understand is that the real threat to Jews was growing and has been, and it's not new. And that right-wing political crazies and militants are really white radicals, that the followers of political backers, of the alt-right and the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are all largely white supremacist groups. Anti-Semitism on the right is baked into the fabric of their part of American society and their politics. During the September 1920 presidential debate, when President Trump was asked to condemn the male-only white supremacist Proud Boys and other militia groups, he replied by instructing them, quote, to stand back and stand by. Charlottesville, synagogue defacing, discriminatory chants, etc., are all deep-rooted in the religious and racial prejudices that have affected Jews throughout history, including in the United States. It is the presence of right-wing anti-Semitism that has been and continues to be a far greater threat for American Jews. Concern for anti-Semitism on the left in America has been promoted largely, as I alluded to earlier, by right-wing Jews and especially the larger portion of the Orthodox and Haredi communities. For reasons which are detailed in a study that I did for an annual review of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life, the segment of Jewish community on the right is composed of this element of the community, and we documented there how and why and to what extent. There is no direct connection between the religious Jewish community's movement to the right and concern for anti-Semitism on the left. Many leaders within the Republican Party and those on the right have been behind efforts attacking the more progressive elements within the Democratic Party. It is within this left-wing faction among Democrats that one has seen most of the anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-BDS voices, and especially the growth of activities on campus, which I must admit is a growing fear for Americans. But one of my arguments, and it's consistently so, is that there is a left-wing anti-Semitism that's present but is transitory, and it has been historically, and it's not as deep-rooted as the anti-Semitism on the right. Needless to say, a lot of the examples have been alluded to here and earlier, but one of the fundamental issues that I do want to underscore is the fact that in the United States today, we have to begin to understand this phenomenon in order to go forward and not to dismiss it. The incidents that occurred in the last 5 years, 6 years of specific attacks on Jews and on Jewish institutions, on synagogues, are coming not from the left, but from the right. And it never has happened before. It is in light of this, of the recent scourge, that Jews need to know not only why it is happening, but what can be done to alleviate, reduce, and eliminate it, or to reduce it. In the United States and throughout the world, there is a rise in the number of sinister and ugly radical organizations. Among them are those that profoundly hate Jews. From church-based organizations to political groups, anti-Semitic factions formed with the express purpose of attacking Jews physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Prejudice and bias against the other, including against Jews, has been part of American society. Supporters of slavery and so on are part of the history of this country, and we have to understand that Jews fall into part of that discussion as well. Let me conclude with the following. Can religious, civic, political leaders address this condition? How can governmental leaders eliminate or at least reduce anti-Semitism while this type of politics remains acceptable to 30 to 40% of the American body politic? Most of the extremist attacks are racial violence against African Americans and Hispanics, but the clear increase in violence against Jews has been stoked by a willingness to continue to propagate anti-Semitic tropes. White extremists, Christian fundamentalists, urban terrorists, and right-wing religious supremacists may not be targeting Jews as their first round of targets, but if Jews assume that the right does not have them in their sights, Jews do so at their peril.